All right. Well, here we are on this beautiful Wednesday morning, at least where I am. It's finally, I hate to say it stopped raining because we really need a lot of rain, but it's been raining a lot in the month of October and early November here in wine country. So it's great to see a little sunlight today. When the sun comes out, it reminds me that we, of course, will be talking about Costières de Nimes, where there's a lot of sun over the course of the year. It's great to see everybody joining up. And if for those of you who are seminar veterans, Zoomland veterans, please say hi. Welcome everybody else who's here. Let us know where you're calling in from. You can talk about the weather or not. You don't have to do that. But it's really a treat to have so many of you join us today for a program that's going to be absolutely delightful. And I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it even when he is on the screen. But I can't tell you, and I'll give him a formal introduction momentarily about how absolutely thrilled and delighted I am to be working with my cohort in crime here, Michel Gassier of Famille Gassier and his wines in the Costières de Nimes. But we're going to give everybody just about another 30 seconds, and then we will get started on time, à l'heure, because that's the way we like to do things. And I know in this surreal post-pandemic, during pandemic, partially pandemic world in which we live right now, that your time is very valuable. And if we can save a few minutes and shave off a few minutes to get you off to work, we're going to want to be able to do that. But I think I speak for everybody now, and I will do it again at the end, when we thank you all for taking time out of your insanely busy schedules, probably busier now than ever, to be with us today when we do this program. So without further ado, it is my pleasure, it is my honor to welcome you to our Immersive Costières de Nimes session. This particular program is one that is near and dear to my heart, both for my love of the wines and my love of the people who represent this area. I'll go through some housekeeping stuff momentarily, as one always needs to do. But before we get started, I did want to give a formal introduction to my cohort in crime, Michel Gassier. Michel is not only a wonderful gentleman, a tremendously talented wine grower, winemaker, but an unofficial ambassador, dare I say, the local ambassador for Costières de Nimes in terms of really being with a finger on the pulse of what's going on here. He is joined too, they're going to be more in the background, but by the able-bodied equipe of Daphne Payan and Eileen Faubrin, who are with us behind the scenes, who will be answering questions, who are both with Interrone. And if you want to know anything about the Rhone Valley that I can't rub my stomach and my head at the same time while trying to do a presentation, they are the people to ask. They will both be on there and ready to help us out. So without further ado, it's just a pleasure to have you with me, Michel. Michel is a jewel. I want to tell you this right now because he hasn't said a peep, but when he starts talking, you're going to say, Evan, he's not French. Evan, the guy's got to be English. Evan, the man has absolutely zero accent. And I have to tell you that when I had the pleasure of meeting Michel up at the Vancouver International Wine Festival in, what would have that been, March of 2019, I guess, just before the pandemic, or whatever that year was, they all kind of run together now. He was on a panel with my good friend Andrew Jefford and a few other winemakers, and he started talking, representing the region, and it wasn't until somebody asked him a question in French that I realized he wasn't American. I just presumed he was because his slang is perfect, his accent is perfect, and he's just a jewel, but you'll hear more now as we buzz in and out. So I wanted to start off with this first slide because this is really important. And I'm sure a lot of you are staring at this right now and scratching your heads. But I wanted, Michel, if perhaps you could help us out here by explaining what the connection is to the blue jeans on the left and the Costières de Nimes on the right. What's going on here?
Well, first, thanks, Evan, for having me. It's always a pleasure and an honor to host a Costières de Nimes seminar with you. We reminisced. It's at, I think, the fourth or the fifth one, and it's always it's always a pleasure. It's a great slide. You've probably, when you look at the blue jeans on the left side, you probably have heard of the word denim. while denim is actually de Nîmes, which means from Nîmes. And it was back in the 19th century, Nîmes was a very important town for creating fabric, and that fabric was shipped all over Europe. And where in particular in Italy. And when Levi Strauss was buying fabric in Genoa, Italy, he found this particular fabric which he really liked. And when he asked where it was from, people said denim, denim. And the color blue was actually applied by the Genoan merchants. So jeans comes from Genoa, and denim comes from Nîmes, and that's the story of the blue jeans.
I love it. The first time I heard that, I jaw dropped. It was like a mic drop. I didn't imagine it, but it does go to show you. I also think it adds a little bit of context to the fact that, long before we started talking about it in a wine context, Nîmes was economically booming, at the end of the 17th century, primarily due to textiles and exports and stuff like that. And I think I was reading somewhere that by the end of the 17th century, they were the third largest industrial city in all of France behind Paris and Lyon. So go figure, as they say, and that's the connection. Remember that story. It's an important one. So let's talk a little bit about housekeeping here. Many of you out there are Zoomland veterans at this point in time, and you know the basic protocols, but for some of you who are perhaps less familiar or tech challenged like I am, please remember to use the chat for chatting, and please select all panelists and attendees when doing that, because if not, only Michelle, myself, Daphne, and Eileen can see what's chatting, and I'm sure you want to reach out to some of your friends out there and do so. But use Q&A specifically for questions. And while Michelle and I are presenting, as I said before, Daphne and Eileen will be answering away on these questions, and we'll pick up where they left off, or if there's anything that would make more sense to be a shared topic with everybody else moving forward when we do get to the dedicated Q&A slides towards the end. I do want to remind you a couple of things. First of all, for those of you just ripped open your box but didn't note it on the side, this is actually Master the World Kit 243C. So for those of you who are veterans, you know that if you actually log on to the MTW site and enter Kit 243C, you will have three interfaces that you can choose. You don't have to do it right now, but after the fact or whatever. And by doing so, you can either do it as a blind tasting, which we'll talk about in a minute. You can do it as sort of like the options game where you guess country and guess region. Well, you know that, but maybe guess grape varieties and things like that. And then thirdly, you can simply hit the reveal the wines thing on the bottom, and that would actually give you sort of a blown out sense of not only the tasting markers and things like that we gridded out when we tasted the wines, but also information about the wines, Costières de Nimes, et cetera, et cetera. So just so that you have it. If you have not done so already, I encourage, I implore, I beg you to open your bottles and pour them out already. Oxygen is your friend, and any wine that has been squished from a 750 into a little 187 ml bottle and then shipped to you just a few days ago is going to be tight coming right out of the chute, and oxygen will help get these wines happier, quicker. In fact, we'll probably go back and encourage you to keep going back and checking in on your wines from time to time, because you're going to find that the evolution of the wines from the time you pour them as you're tasting them is going to be exponential. You should feel free to engage the glasses anytime you want. One thing that drives, I believe, all of us crazy is when you're in a webinar or even just going to an old school wine tasting, and they talk and talk and talk for an hour, and in the last 20 minutes, you have to plow through all the wines. We don't like to do that. So you should feel free to enjoy the wines 1 through 6 as you like. You can do it blind or you don't, because as you know right now, all the bottles as they came to you in the boxes look like this. They all have this fabulous, consistent Master of the World front label. They are all sleeved, which is to say, if you look at the back label there, this is not obviously the kit, but if you were to pull off that pressure sensitive sticker where it says peel to reveal and literally unsleeve at the back label, would look like this, and it would reveal, again, this is the one, but it would reveal the identities of what you have. So if you really want to do this as a blind tasting, because a glance at the label is literally worth 30 years of experience, that's your call to do, because you'll be less prejudiced, if you will, by the time you go in. However, if you're like, it's too early, Evan, I don't want to play today, and you want to rip the sleeves off and know exactly what you're tasting before we talk about them, that's totally cool too. Once again, it's your call. Please know that we're going to go through all the wines individually, and we will call them out and speak to them. As we're talking through them, I'll probably lead. Michelle will be my color person and add some anecdotes about the family, the people, the region, whatever. Beyond that, I'll be more of the play-by-play and sort of giving you the factoids, but we will go through them all individually. So without further ado, let us move on to the next slide. So the Costières de Nimes is a very unique terroir. We'll look on the next slide sort of at a map that situates the region within the greater zone of the Rhone Valley. But it's really, I think, an appropriate way to think about it as sort of the segue, if you will, the liaison between when you're leaving Provence and moving west towards the Languedoc area, and you pass through this sort of DMZ, if you will, as I like to call it, of the Camargue. And it's an area that sits, the Camargue is the Western Europe's largest delta. And this is where the Rhone River literally meets the Mediterranean Sea. And I truly believe one of the greatest secrets of all of the Southern Rhone Valley. Michelle, I know when we were talking earlier, you expressed how absolutely a metaphor for this region that the particular photo that we're looking at is. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit for us?
Yeah, it's the expression that it sits right above the delta is actually true and exemplified in this picture. What you see in the backdrop is not the Rhone River, it's actually marshes, the marshes of Camargue, and there are many different marshes between the Costières and the actual shore of the Mediterranean. But it means that the Costières is the last body of land before we turn to combination of water and shallow lands. And we'll see it later. It has a big impact on not just the microclimate, as we will discuss later, but also on the ecosystem that lives around here. We are greatly influenced by water, and that's the signature of our appellation.
Yeah, great. So, Michelle, maybe help us a little bit more and situate us. Obviously, this last one gave us a photo and gave us some sort of textural overview, but maybe kind of explain within the nature of the diagram on the right-hand side, sort of what that means, where it is. And obviously, we're seeing our little blue Mediterranean in the south, but the whole positioning of Costières.
Right. So this is a close-up of the Southern Rhone. And you'll recognize appellations like Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which are about 45-minute drive from Nîmes. We located on the southwest edge of the Southern Rhone, and it's less obvious than in the previous slide, but we're very close to the Mediterranean. So that gives you a little bit of a positioning within the Rhone, the Southern Rhone region. And just as a little factoid, the Rhone is actually what divides the old province of Provence, which is on the eastern side of the Rhone, to the old province of Languedoc. I'm not talking wine region, I'm talking about a historical province, which is on the right side of the Rhone. So, 1/3 of all Côtes du Rhône are produced on the right side of the Rhone, and which is in the historical province of Languedoc, but are in the Rhone Valley family of wine and not in the Languedoc family of wine. Just the point.
There you go.
Right.
Yeah, no, and we'll speak more of this here. So a couple of pointers that I think are probably giving you a snapshot, if you will, of this place before we delve into the specifics. So as Michel mentioned, and as I think was probably visually brought out on the last map, so this is indeed the southernmost appellation in the Rhone Valley. But what's interesting here, and we'll get into the specifics here for a multitude of reasons and a confluence of different characteristics, it's also the coolest area too, which is, again, I think perhaps you juxtapose, you go, well, you're going further south, you're getting warmer, it's getting close to the equator, yet you're telling me it's the coolest. So we'll explain that as we move forward in the presentation. The second thing that I think is really important and very true when you try the wines, I think and you're trying the wines, I hope you're enjoying them as we're talking, is that they are unmistakably Rhone in character, geographically in this area. The other thing that I think is really interesting about the people in the Costières de Nimes is twofold. Number one, not to say that people don't blend well across the Rhone Valley, because they do, but the people here who are doing the job are really skilled. I just find a deftness and an aptitude for the context of creating wines of assemblage that they do there. And obviously, if experience is your teacher, and we'll talk about the history in a couple of minutes, needless to say, they have not just 100 years or a couple of 100 years, but they have millennia of experience on which they're basing a lot of what they do. And another beautiful shot of the Rhone there. So let's begin with some general factoids here, just the numbers for you. I do want to point out that everybody got this in the package, along with the tasting mat and your always happy, popular Master of the World sticker and all that other good stuff. But the information that you have here, the infographic that you have here is really helpful. It really helps summarize and put together a lot of things that are going on. But you'll notice that particularly down the right-hand column, a lot of the figures are, when this was actually physically printed, which was back in 2019 for 2018, the figures that you will have to hear today, Daphne and Eileen and I have been working behind the scenes with Michel. Everything that you have is literally the most current, obviously not necessarily inclusive of this year's harvests and things like that, but suffice it to say, more current than what you're going to see there. So there's 70 producers in the area, which again, given the volume of wine that they make, which you can see in bullet 5 here, may be a surprise. There are 9 co-ops, and co-ops are very important in this part of the world and produce wines of extremely high quality. I think one of the elements of Costières de Nimes that I think deserves a shout out comparatively is that, oftentimes you hear the word cooperative and you roll your eyes, thinking, well, great, it's a place for everybody to sell their fruit, but the quality of wines, blah, blah, blah. I find that the co-ops here do a really good job across the board and should be embraced rather than admonished for the quality of the work that they're doing. The area breaks down into 43% red, a little bit more rosé. We'll talk about the importance in the emergence of rosés throughout all of the southern part of France, and certainly in Costières de Nimes later. And then 9% white. So, whites are a bit of a jewel. There's not as many of them as that were there. That actually has an effect on the rosé, which we'll talk about a little bit later too. There's just a little above 7,000 vineyard acres planted across the region. Obviously, the region itself is more geographically rich and diverse and other topography and stuff like that beyond purely the vineyard acreage. 30% is organically grown. And this is a number, as we talk a little bit about sustainability and organics and biodynamics and stuff like that later. This is growing with a bullet every year, as they would say on the billboard charts. More and more people here are embracing organics and sustainability. And frankly, the region is a leader in this area, as Michel will elaborate on when we get to that particular element. As I said before, about just short of 2 million 12 bottle cases. Obviously, that could go higher in time or lower in time, depending on the nature of what Mother Nature wants to deliver on a given year, and represents about 8% of all of Rhone Valley vineyard production there, which again, you wouldn't necessarily think about, but is absolutely true. So let's talk a little bit about history. And I am certainly not going to be the one to talk to you about history when I have the luxury of having Michel here. But suffice it to say, this was not a region that was literally discovered 7 years ago. It goes back quite a long period of time. And Michel, if you want to give us a so-called Reader's Digest version from 31 BC to the present, we would be most grateful.
Actually, I'm going to go even before 31 BC. What you see in this picture is the Colosseum that we have in Nimes. As you can see, it's an incredible shape. It's one of the most or best preserved Roman Colosseum in the world. And the Romans conquered the territory right around 31 BC. Um, and what was surprising is you'd think that it's the Romans who brought winemaking techniques to the Celtic tribes that used to live there. But actually, when the Romans got to Nimes, the tribes were already making wine, and actually pretty good wine. And the reason why is because they had learned, so first they started trading with the Greeks about 600 BC. Then they liked the product so much they were taught how to grow grapes and make wine. And so when the Romans got there 600 years later, they're already established wine producers. And throughout history, we have records of wine being sold to Rome from the Nîmes area. So the wine was appreciated way back when. Um, and then in during the 14th century, when the popes were in Avignon, also we have records of popes buying wines from the Nîmes area for their court. Another sign that the wines were in high regard. And then the appellation probably went through the lower point in its history is right after phylloxera crisis hit the French vineyards, so end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th, when the vineyards were decimated, and the options that were taken by the people replanting was more quantity over quality. And I think that's when Costières de Nimes went through, I'd say, a phase where we were not, we probably lost our image, we lost our drive for high quality, and things started to move again when we became an AOP in 1986 and joined the Rhone Valley in 1989. So we pretty much are like a century of lost time. It's not because the terroir or the varietals or the climate was not conducive to making great wines. It was just, an option that the people that didn't take or chose to take way back when. And so we've been fighting since then. And I think that little by little, our quality has gone up, our reputation has, and I'm hoping that seminar like tonight will participate in us reconquering our position as a great place for great wines in the south of France.
My personal experience, Michel, has been that once people start to pay attention and taste the wines, and we'll talk about some of the parallels and obviously the amazing stuff, the grapes later on. We are making good headway there. I thought it would be interesting, perhaps before we leave this slide. A lot of you probably take a look at a logo or something and kind of move on and all that. But there is a particular significance to the logo and to that alligator and everything. I was wondering, it's a great, again, another lovely little story. If you could kind of explain the significance of what's going on there with that reptilian creature.
I'd love to say that the Camargue, the marshes are full of crocodiles, but it's not true. That also is a historical logo. Um, During the expansion of the Roman empires, the Caesars' biggest fear was that a victorious general would return to Rome with his troops and topple him over and conquer power in Rome. So in order to keep them at bay, they used to give them territories to administer as quote unquote a reward for their victories. And Nîmes and the province was given to the Roman legions that were victorious in Egypt. And having conquered Egypt, they created their own logo, which was a crocodile chained to a palm tree. They had tamed the crocodile from the Niles. They had tamed the Egyptians. That was the symbolic behind that logo. They brought it with them to the city of Nîmes, and it's been its logo since then.
That's great. Again, I love things like that. The factoids are just absolutely fabulous. Thank you for sharing. Well, I'm sure a few of you are thirsty at this point in time, or at least wanting to be guidedly thirsty through all of this. And we're going to start with the whites. You have a pair of them, wines 1 and 2, and we'll go through them in a second. But please taste them. And it's always lovely to have referential tastings where you can taste through a couple of wines side by side. And what I'm going to do is explain sort of the commonalities of what you're going to find across the board in white wines, and then we're going to go through the wines individually. So whites you're going to find are, first of all, they're not a huge amount of the production. As you remember from the slide earlier, they're just about 9%. So there's not a lot of them there. I'm always reminded that good things come in small packages, being all 5'4" of me. So in this case, there's not a lot of wines, fairly diminutive in terms of the production, but it packs a punch, if you will. And they're some of the best wines, frankly, that I think the region is making. They are generally going to be combinations of Grenache Blanc, Roussanne, and Marsanne, driving primary varieties, of which at least 2 of those wines must be included in any wine that carries the Costières de Nimes label. Bourboulon, Clairette, Vermentino, which is known locally as Rolle, and Viognier are all considered to be supplementary grapes. So a couple of things here to think about it. Number one, there's going to be, because the proximity, and Michel alluded to the Camargue and all of that, I find in general that there is, particularly as you move further south, sort of an inherent salinity, or almost like a sea spray element that you're going to find in a lot of the white wines, specifically as you get closer to the estuary. And I want to give a little bit of a shout out specifically for those of you who are looking for the unicorns out there to Clairette. Clairette as a variety is a secret spice, if you will, in the region, kind of like what Counoise would be, perhaps if you moved east into Châteauneuf-du-Pape. The people down there will always tell you the secret sauce is the Counoise, right? But Clairette can play a really lovely job here. And in fact, Clairette de Bellegarde is its own nested AOP within there, and is worthy of exploration. So we have 2 wines. We have our first wine, the Mas de Bresson, Cuvée Tradition, and secondarily, we have the Chateau de Valcombe, Costières de Nimes Blanc, both 2020 vintage. So let's jump into the first wine first. This wine, as you can see, is majority Roussanne. And again, I think in this regard, a fairly classic thing. And you'll recognize the Roussanne by the extreme perfume and expressiveness, which is obviously enhanced by the Viognier and all of its lovely aromatics. Grenache Blanc is always going to give you texture. It's going to give you, dare I say, gras, as they would say in French. And the Marsanne is going to provide sort of a little bit of the in-between thing. One of the elements as you become used to the template that we're walking through here across the 6 wine, and is I'm going to stress, underscore the sort of environmental practices that each particular winery has. So you'll notice that there, and again, we have a dedicated discussion topic about this a little bit later. And so here you can see not only sustainable farming, but certification of organics beginning. And these people over at Mas de Bresson have been leaders in this area here for a long time. No stainless steel, no ML. And although I didn't get an average vine age for this, they've been producing since frankly the 70s, 50s, 70s, et cetera. So the vines, a lot of old vines there. This is, again, I think, a wonderful wine to start at, in the sense that it sort of validates this historical thing. So the property of Mas de Bresson goes back a long time. It's the Marès family, and Roger, specifically in 64, and today it's Franz Cyril who make the wines there. I think one of the great elements about what's happening in France today, and just frankly all over the world, is younger winemakers and people in general traveling more. So not only is Cyril, obviously, and his father very strong producers here in the Southern Rhone, but Cyril himself has, spent time traveling to other regions of France and working with, great people like Bruno and Paul Prats, and worked at Chalon in California, et cetera, and have sort of a more global view, a global approach towards their wines and where their wines sit in the pantheon of wines around the world today, to sort of bring out the expressiveness of what wines are doing there, but do so there. And he also obviously consults along the way. So just a delightful wine. Michel, anything you would add? The Marès family better than I do. So
No, I mean, Cyril is a good example, and I think that all the wines, with perhaps the exception of Chapoutier's wine in tonight's lineup, are made by sons or daughters of previous winemakers. And why is that important? It is important in 2 folds. Number one, when you make, or you're aiming to make terroir-driven wines, you need to understand your terroir. You only harvest once a year, and the knowledge that your elders can pass on to you is incredibly valuable, uh, and prevents you from making the mistakes of trial and error. And the second thing that is important also is the fact that, again, most of these properties have been in families for several generations, which means the land is paid for, which means that the production costs are way lower. And when you buy this bottle for a mere $14, all you're paying for is truly what it costs to produce the wine. You're not contributing to paying back the mortgage that the winemaker has taken in order to purchase the land. And that's also is one of the great feature of Costières is its approachability in terms of price and its price value, which to me is one of the very best of France.
Yeah, no, I think those are points well taken, not only because, and we're certainly aware here in the United States, if you look at a place like California, where people are literally leveraged up to their proverbial eyeballs in debt over the land, the mortgages, the amounts of money they have to pay, and having property that's been in families for so long, and to your point, is paid off, allows you to share, if you will, the savings there. I think that the point taken in this wine again serves as a metaphor as we move forward here, regardless of what the price points are. The wines punch above their weight all the time, and there are so many other wines, so-called white Rhone blends, if you will, that cost double this price point, but are not nearly as frankly delicious as this particular wine is. And I think this wine's a lovely wine to start with because, one, obviously the inox allows you to taste the purity of the fruit, but I think the blend itself too is a fairly representative style blend of what we're showing today. So as we talk about wine two now and move into that, again, we're dealing with a Roussanne driven blend. Here, your primary supplemental grape is Marsanne. Once again, very strong environmental foundation here with agriculture biodynamique and Demeter certified. Here, once again, not using anything to sort of mask any flavors. So the wine's been done in concrete, some batonnage, which I probably would suggest would have been the case earlier too. Vine age of about 15 years. And Valcombe is another lovely property. I've had the pleasure of working with Michel a couple of times here. And this is, again, to sort of underscore what Michel said, this is a 10th generation family estate that goes back in the family to the 1700s. And it's actually the southernmost estate in the Costières de Nimes, so approaching the estuary proper. The Rincombe family who operates today, and Dominique and his sons and nephew Basile and Nicolas run the property today. But he was also responsible, Charles Rincombe, as you can see here, for being the first person to plant Syrah in the appellation. Now they print that. I don't, Michel, maybe you can fill us in, and maybe somebody else did it at the same time too. I don't know, but nevertheless, I'm sure from a qualitative standpoint that really helped bring in a whole new thinking after the Second World War with respect to what was going on there. 28 hectare property, about 1,000 feet in altitude, literally in the shadow of Mount Ventoux nearby, and another delicious wine. Michel, anything you'd like to add?
Um, no, it's interesting as the 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 two properties are diametrically opposed in terms of location. One, Bressade is much closer to the Rhone Valley, facing north, more of a Mistral-induced microclimate. Valcombe is on the southern slope, way closer to the marshes, much more of a sea breeze-induced style. It's in both cases, I think that the whites show tremendous freshness, surprisingly so for a Southern Rhone or Southern Rhone whites. And I think this is a very good example of the style of Costières de Nimes. Is we are definitely Rhone with that added freshness level that comes from our microclimate, and it's very tangible in whites, but you'll see and you'll feel it in the reds as well. And to me, this is really what separates Costières from, I'd say, your standard Côte du Rhône, and gives her, I frequently I say, why have five Côte du Rhône? Perhaps you can have one less, but you can have a Costières which provide a totally different tasting experience.
No,
Not to denigrate Côte du Rhône. I mean, they're great wines and there's variety, but it is a very distinctive style.
I think you bring up a really good point, Michelle, because as people are looking at whether you're in retail and building your shelf space out, or you're putting together a wine list or whatever, we tend to think monolithically about Côte du Rhône, right? And just do so in a way. And what you have to realize is that we're here in Nîmes today. We'll be in Luberon, many of us next week when we talk about that too. There are areas that are very different in terms of style, maybe partially by grape types, but certainly in interpretation, as dictated by climate, as dictated by terroir. And people should think about, you wouldn't want to have a California wine list where everything was Napa. For example, you would want a diversification across different appellations. And I think that's a point you bring up well and critically to how people should think about Rhone selections as they're looking at the landscape of how they work with them. Question for you, Michelle. And again, we have a small sample set, if you will, of two wines, but I'm struck by the preponderance of Roussanne in both of these wines. If we were to look at a sampling of, say, a dozen wines across white wines across Costières de Nimes, would that be a fairly typical profile with Roussanne leading? Do we just happen to land with two wines that had a preponderance of Roussanne? What would be sort of your archetypal white blend in Costières de Nimes?
I'd say that most likely Grenache Blanc is the dominant varietal in terms of acreage. Roussanne would be a close second. Typically, Roussanne, being small berries and thicker skins, tend to make whites with a little more extract, a little more body. So there's I'd say a propensity. I mean, most people would use their entry level wine would be more Grenache dominated. The minute they have like their next level up or higher up, tend to be a little heavier in Roussanne. Marsanne is a very small percentage of plantings in Costières de Nimes, and Marsanne is a lot more productive than Roussanne, and it gives unbelievable results on shallow soils and granite, for instance, because it showcases the minerality. The minute you have a little richer soil with depth, Marsanne tends to be overproducing and making wine with little character. So it can be a fabulous varietal, but it can be a blah kind of varietal if it overproduces. So typically, Grenache Blanc and Roussanne would be your two go-to varietals for whites.
Got it. Got it. And just before we leave the whites and move on here, I just want to give a shout out and amplify the freshness, the brightness that you speak of. I think is very evident in both wines. And I do think, and I don't know whether it's just suggestion in your mind or leading a witness, but I do believe this second wine, whether it's the context of indigenous fermentation bringing it out, but there is sort of a saline-esque character, a sea spray-like character there, whether that's coming literally off the Camargue and into the vineyards and permeating into the fruit itself via the vines, or whether it's just product of imagination, but there seems to be something like that. So point well taken. All right, well, let's move on here. And I do think the whole sustainability push that has been happening in Nîmes for some time now is really worth bringing out here. And as we mentioned earlier, and it's worth validating here, now 30% of the vines are grown organically. And this is a result of a lot of input and effort into green initiatives. So I was wondering if maybe you could flesh this out a little bit more, perhaps speak a little bit to the specific programs that are on the bottom of the slide.
Yeah, so we're with 30% of the vines grown organically. We have the highest percentage of the Rhone Valley. That to me is a sign of how dynamic and forward thinking the growers of the appellation are. We were the first ones also to create a landscape charter to protect our landscapes, the beauty of our zone, and as well as to entice farming practices. And I think that it contributed to having such a high percentage of production being organic. We are continuing, that percentage is growing very quickly. And a lot of the young generations are coming back to work with their parents. Usually, you see that within a couple years, that property turns or converts into organic. So there's and as most properties see the next generation coming back to take over, we see that percentage going up uh, quite rapidly. So it is a strong point for our AOP.
Can you speak, Michelle, a little bit to, I know you and I have talked about it before that, oftentimes people want to be organic, but the climate or whatever will not allow them to be organic. Can you speak a little bit as to what makes Costières de Nimes such a magic spot for your ability, should you choose to convert to organic relatively easily?
Um, the obviously, I would say two things: A, the climate; B, the soil. Why the climate? Because we have about 300 days of sunshine. We have a fairly windy zone, whether it blows from the north, and that's the Mistral, or it blows from the Mediterranean, and that's what we call the Greek in our zone. And it helps dry off any kind of moisture that we might have on the leaves, and that prevents mildew or powdery mildew from developing. And the soil is because it's so rocky, that soil holds. So when you're an organic, uh, you have to prevent disease from happening because you don't have access to the what we call the systemic products. Systemic, are the chemicals are used in conventional agriculture, which you spray. The chemical penetrates the leaves, migrate through the sap flow, and attack the infestation wherever it is. And you have either insecticide or fungicide that work that way. Well, in organic, these are not allowed. You're only using what we call contact sprays, which means the products stay on the outside and prevents from developing. But if you have an infestation, they will not cure it. So basically, those products get washed every time you get a rainfall. And so let's say you get a big rainfall and all your protection gets washed out. Your vineyards are left with no protection. And if you have another rain episode coming, let's say 3 days later, if you don't have protection while it rains, you might get the infestation. So you need to be able to enter your vineyard and apply another spray, a preventative spray. Now, if you have a heavy clay kind of soil, and if you plow, which in organic we usually do because that's how you weed control, you might not be able to drive through with your tractor because the soil will not hold the weight of the tractor. But because we have rocky, very filtering soils, even if we get a big downpour, the next day or 2 days later, we can drive by in our vineyards. So the combination of the microclimate and the type of soil makes it a lot easier for us to convert to organic than most places.
And that's why we call it immersive Costières de Nimes, because you learn all of these deeper facts than you would if you were just looking through a book or on a website. So let's move now to our rosé. And rosé, as you remember before, is 48% of the total to production. So it is categorically slightly more than red. And the driving factor here. Now, let's face it, the reality of rosé is it's always been important. It's been relatively stable, although with a bit of an upshoot in this part of the world. But rosé is happening, and it's happening everywhere, and I need not tell any of you that. What I can tell you is that here, for rosés, that Syrah, Mourvèdre, and Grenache are going to make up 80% of the blend, again, by law, and then that remaining 20% can be Carignan, it can be Cinsault, or it could be white varieties. And I bring up the white varieties element here because there are other places as you move, particularly further east, where we're utilizing white grapes for acidity, using white grapes for softening, etc., is a fairly natural practice. But I remind you, and I remind you because Michelle reminded me when we spoke at one point in time, that there's so little white wine in Costières de Nimes that people would generally not even really think that much about using the white wine in their rosés when, number one, the red grapes are so capable of making delightful rosé on their own. And secondarily, it would cut into their white wine production, and they don't need that. The other thing that I think is important to note here is that the style of Tavel is too, like I said before, not sort of monolithic, because is a huge range of styles here. I put that it's not Tavel, although there are some wines that I've had from Costières de Nimes that are very Tavelian, if I could say that, darker colors, richer flavors, bigger wines that can age, wines that are meant for the table, etc. And there are those that are sort of more Provençal-esque, that are paler, lighter in color, refreshing, porch pounders, if you will, delightful little wines. And then there's sort of everything in between. So it becomes difficult to put rosé from Costières de Nimes in a little box and put a little bow around it and say this is what it is when there is such a range. But I will tell you that we're tasting one wine. One wine is not a gargantuan sample size, but nevertheless, if you're interested in kicking the tires, explore a greater range of styles within rosé here, because I think you'll find a greater diversity that you might in other regions. Safe to say, Michel, before we taste the wine?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And, the winemaker has a huge influence on the style that he or she picks to do in terms of rosé, from, like you said, the super dark, almost light red kind of rosé to the almost white-like Provence style. I just say that it's a lot easier to make. The market wants paler rosés than, let's say, 20 years ago. And it's a lot easier to do it with Grenache and Cinsault. So most rosés are done in Costières tend to be made mostly with those two varietals. As a result, the reds will be predominantly made with Syrah, which we'll get there later. But so that's also a small tidbits about Costières.
Before we jump to the wine, you had mentioned when we were chatting earlier that a lot of what people do or how they interpret rosé, to your point, is familial, it's generational, it's what they envisioned philosophically as to what we're doing. Do you find that the producers in Costières tend to stick to their guns and are less market, driven by the wind? If they see that, Provence is making all these times, somebody who might have made a richer, lighter red style, if you will, of rosé would make a switch over, or are people pretty much sticking to their guns?
No, I think people are smarter than that. I think that if you're really gung ho, you make a small cuvee where you stick to your guns, and then you make a larger one where you do whatever the market wants to taste, basically.
There you go. Cover all your
So
bets. I appreciate that.
exactly.
I appreciate that. All right. Well, the wine that we have is from our friends over at Mascarlo. It's their Génération Rosé, a blend of Grenache, some Syrah, and Mourvèdre. Again, agriculture bio certified and made with a 12-hour maceration. Vine age here is profound, which is nice, and I think that particularly in a rosé wine, if the vines are older, you get an additional depth of flavor and perfume that you're not if you're just working purely with young wines. This is another property that goes back to the 17th century, as we saw before, and has had its land farm for just a few years. I actually find this second bullet, as I was researching, to be a delight, because this is a winery of a restaurateur, and Paul-Antoine Blanc, who used to own the Pied de Cochon in Paris, over by Les Halles, which was literally back in the late 70s, early 80s, when I lived there, was a restaurant that I ate at quite frequently. And I'm sure, although he would never remember me, I met Monsieur Blanc a couple of times, and we had a few chats together. But he fell in love with the property on clearly a buying visit in the 80s, and bought it and sold the restaurant and moved to Bellegarde, and continued on as a winemaker rather than a restaurateur. You'll see that the gentleman, again, we talked a little bit about younger people traveling and learning different things and bringing back their findings. This wine is under the supervision, if you will, of Cyril Marès, who, as you remember from Wine 1 at Mas de Bresson, also oversees this wine. I think what's interesting, and one of the things I'm really, by the way, delighted about with our new, for those of you who are recognizing new bottles and new packaging for Master of the World, is that when you pour the wines, particularly the whites and the rosé in this case, out of the green glass, the color is more stunning. And I think what you get here is a wine that clearly is showing more of that salmon hue and that touch towards an easier drinking style, but nevertheless has some gravitas to it. Any words of wisdom that you can share about what they're doing over at Mascarlo, and any wonderful stories about Monsieur Blanc?
No, I think that the style that they usually pick for rosé is linked to the fact that they were in the restaurant business, so they love to make rosés that actually go with food. It's not a drink by the pool kind of a rosé. It's a little more serious. It has some depth. It's a great wine with food, and I think that that stems from the Paul Blanc's first career.
Absolutely. I also think, and again, noting here, and this is, I think, in that respect, sort of typical of what you said, no white wine, no white grapes in this wine whatsoever. Yet, as Michel said earlier, still an underscored freshness and refreshing nature there, all of which is done by obviously vinification and style, but also I think inherent to the terroir here. Obviously, at a fairly sizable percentage of the production in Costières, an area that's worth exploring. Needless to say, rosé is very popular here today. And I think as you're building out your rosé collection, wherever it is that you are, having as much diversity within that, countries, regions, grapes, etc., will just make for a much more interesting rainbow on your shelf or on your list. So uh, tip of the hat to the, or beret, I should say, to the rosé. So let's talk a little bit more about terroir. And I'm going to get out of your way here on this one, Michel. We actually have a slide about terroir and then a couple of slides on climat. But I do think that this is an interesting slide to talk about, and let's go for it. So walk us through what we see here.
Okay, so the Costière is a terrace that was created by the Rhone between 1 and 2 million years ago, and it's entirely constituted of rolled pebbles, but there are differences. Um, the northern part of the Costière, the deposit came directly from the Rhone, which originates from the Geneva Lake, which is right at the foot of the Northern Alps. And the southern part of the Costière, Gallet, came from the Durance, which is a tributary of the Rhone, and that comes from the Southern Alps. So even though in both cases there are rolled pebbles, their mineral composition is different because the mineral composition of the Southern Alps is different than the Northern Alps. So in the north, you see a very much larger, rounder, homogeneous in color kind of pebbles. And in the south, it's smaller, more angular, and much more diverse in terms of color and shapes. And the combination of different mineral composition and different microclimate gives distinctive styles between the southern vineyards versus the northern vineyards.
Yeah, and we're going to explore that momentarily. I wanted to ask for your reaction to a topic. I was doing some reading and some research, and not more than once, I should say, not just once, but more than once, I saw Costières Nimes referred to as being a maritime Châteauneuf-du-Pape. What do you think of that statement? Is that accurate? Is it inaccurate? Partially accurate? What are your thoughts to
Well, it's an honor to be compared to Châteauneuf-du-Pape, so I'll take it any day. Maritime, it's true. I mean, we have a very strong sea influence, and we pretty much work with the same varietals, and we also have the rolled pebbles like they do. So yeah, it's pretty accurate.
that?
I'm going to
Absolutely.
keep that.
There you
Thank
go,
you.
and move it. You can use that way. I wish I had made it up, but I will not claim credit for something I read. I'm hoping you can walk us through the next slide here, because this is, for the people that are geeks of this sort of stuff, I know they're probably just, smiling like a Cheshire cat right now. I think for people who are probably a little bit more intimidated by looking at soils and stuff like that, this might be a bit daunting. But maybe if you can, in the eloquent way you always do, kind of walk us through just the general thinking of how we would look at this slide, as you can see from the left to right, northwest, if you will, to southeast, as you orient yourself.
Wow. I'm going to try to be synthetic. Um, first think about um, we're going tertiary period. We're talking about 50 million years before today. The Mediterranean Sea was reaching as far as Lyon. So the entire area of Costières de Nimes was underwater, under the Mediterranean. And the settlements, or what settled, is a combination of sand and seashells, that created a lot of calcium. Then think about 2 million years ago, the Mediterranean Sea has receded, and the Rhone gushes and deposit the rolled pebbles. And then the Alps pop out, and it creates a lot of tension in the Earth's crust, and it creates folds as like tremors from the rise of the Alps, and it pushes some of that terroir from the tertiary period up. So what you see when you see the dotted pink line, this is the tertiary terroir that comes up, and then what the rolled pebble is what was deposited more recently. So you can find interesting points where actually you have certain vineyards that sit not on top of that rolled pebble, but on top of that sandy and chalk tertiary terroir. It's very small. It represents a very small percentage of the production of Costières de Nimes, but it gives a very distinctive style. And I know because we have one vineyard that happens to be in that situation, and it gives us very distinctive style of wine from the others. So this is what you see, the shape of the terroir, which is that little terrace and that little height, which is only about 100 meters above the sea level. So we can't really talk about different in elevation as a differentiating marker within Costières de Nimes, but the elevation is correlated to a different terroir in some cases when you reach the higher zone of the Costières.
Great, thank you. And thank you for that succinct simplification of what could otherwise be a scary and daunting image here. Let's take a step back and bring something a little bit more approachable, if you will, from a graphical standpoint, and also one that I know you and I have talked about before is so important because in and of itself, between the diagram and then obviously the text on the right side really embraces what Costières de Nimes is all about.
Yeah, those who understand how California works will get it instantly. This is what we call thermal winds. Costières being so close to the Mediterranean and the water benefits from what we call sea breezes during the day. In the summer, the sun warms up the earth and warms up the rose pebbles, and then the air that sits on top of land gets hot and rises. It creates a draft that pulls air that sits above the Mediterranean, and that air, not only is it cooler, but it's also higher in humidity, and it mitigates the drying and the stressful influence that the vineyards receive from the summer conditions. And also, you can see it in the morning where, like in California, is not quite as drastic, but frequently we have fog in the morning, which is the condensation of the moisture that has been brought in from the previous day and that settles during the night. So it's truly that phenomenon that allows Costières to be the cooler spot during the summer within the Rhone Valley, even though we're at the extreme south of its territory. Then the rest is self-explanatory.
Yeah, talk about obviously being here in California, we're talking a lot about the last couple of years and droughts and rains, and we're all happy that things are going on right now. Typically, it says annually you get about a little less than 29 inches of rain per year, and it's infrequent, and it generally tends to fall mainly in the late summer and into the early autumn. What's going on in Costières de Nimes? Are you guys and what is your water table like? What is your water situation like? Talk to us a little bit about what's going on.
So in terms of rainfall, if it was nicely distributed, it'd be totally sufficient. And some years it is, some years it can be problematic. Fortunately for us, we have, I'm going to say for now, unlimited supply of water should we need it, because in the 50s there was some work that was done, and a canal was created that pumps the water from the Rhone about 20 miles before it dumps into the Mediterranean, so that fresh water gets lost for human use, and irrigates the entire Costières area. And so we have water pretty much at every vineyard corner if we want to, and which is, not only is it great for winemaking, but it's also great for the diversity of our agriculture. And versus the rest of the Southern Rhone, we have very mixed agriculture. We have a lot of fruit production. We have olives, we have peaches, apricots, we have a lot of vegetable, and we have some lamb grazing as well. So I think that for sustainable agriculture, it's a much better model than the monocrop of just vineyards.
I have to ask you, since you spoke of lamb, something I love tremendously. Is your lamb pré-salé lamb? So would that be sort of this sort of, if you will, pre-salted lamb because it's feeding on pastures not far from the estuaries, or is that just a little dream I have in my brain right now?
Nah, unfortunately, it's just a dream right now, but it's a great idea. I should talk. I should talk to some of the growers that we work with. I mean, the ranchers that we work with, as we get our sheeps in our vineyards in the winter. It might be a nice chat to have with them.
Yeah, well, they're the people in Mont Saint Michel. They can't have a complete monopoly on pré-salé
Right.
animals and stuff like that. Well, let's move now into red wines. It was just a thought, just something we could talk about later when we do that. But red wines obviously are a very, very important element there, and almost as much red as there is rosé. We spoke before of the prominence of Syrah and Grenache along with Mourvèdre, and Mourvèdre I think is worth pointing out, particularly, I guess there's a clone of it, the Plon de Saint-Gilles, down in the further south of Mourvèdre. That's a very specific selection that maybe you can talk about a little bit later. But those three grapes must combine for at least 80% of the blend, with Carignan, Cinsault, and Marselan being supportive grapes. I'd love to get your thoughts on that before we talk about our last three wines. What is the general feeling? Marselan, I was chatting with one producer at one point, and he was very negative. He sort of felt maybe because of the Bordelais parentage within the Marselan grape that it was an extreme outlier. Is Marselan something you're seeing more of? Is it consistent? Is it something you think we're going to hear more about moving forward, or is it just sort of like it's just there so people use it?
Uh, it's an interesting varietal. Um, did we need it? I'm not sure. I think we have great, Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre, Carignan, Cinsault are all great varietals. Um, they're, with the exception of Syrah, all coming from Spain. So from places that are further south from us. So I think they're well lined up for global warming. Marselan is a hybrid between Cabernet Sauvignon and Grenache. It's an interesting varietal. I mean, it makes good wines, deeply colored, high octane, fruit forward. It's an interesting varietal. Um, Again, did we need it? I am not sure. It's
Yeah.
an easy varietal to make good red wines with. Uh, Carignan is more challenging. Mourvèdre is more challenging. Um, so
Yeah.
I don't know. I was when it was time to vote whether we would accept it in the appellation in the General Assembly. I was the only one to vote against it.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Well, it's a grape that's interesting. It's people follow the world around. Obviously it's done well in other places. I think perhaps more so too. There's a lot of notoriety around China, where Marselan has become sort of a primary blending grape in Ningxia places, and down in South America. But I've not yet heard perhaps outside of the Bordelais now, who are allowed to add a few percentage points of it into their wine legally, where it's getting a lot of stuff these days. So your no vote actually reflects a lot of what I had heard about it, but nice to know
Yeah,
you were the
it's
lone no vote.
it's not ripe until it reaches at least 15% alcohol, and
Uh,
I don't think this is where the world is going to. There's a big trend for people looking for drinks with maybe a little less alcohol, and this varietal definitely does not go in that direction.
there you go.
So it does, but
Okay.
you know,
All right. Well, we have three wines here, and I hope you're sort of enjoying them again, side by side, as they do represent not only a trio of different years, but also of different blends here that we'll go through. We're going to start with Michel's wine, then we're going to move to the Chapoutier La Ciboise, and then finish with a wine appropriately called Denim at the very, very end. So we're going to come back to where we began at the very beginning on that first slide. So, Michel, if you could take this through this wine. First of all, what a treat to have a primarily Mourvèdre wine with obviously Grenache and Syrah, but also that's got some bottle age on it. And I think the wine's showing beautifully. I would say that if you weren't on the call. But maybe talk to us a little bit about your wine. And for those of you who don't know Michel, Michel is fourth generation in the Costières de Nimes and one of the leaders, obviously on the Appellation board and responsible for the recent resurgence and emergence of this increased stature of this lesser appreciated appellation. But hopefully all of us today are going to make sure that that's not the case moving forward. So Michel, talk to us about your wine.
um, well, le Coucardier is a homage to the tradition of Camargue of bull games, not bullfights, but bull games. Every village in Costières has arenas, and the tradition of bull games in Camargue is you play with the bull, you try to catch little attributes that are hung between the horns, trying not to get gored, and the public just watches and places bets on whomever was going to be successful. And when you grow up in this region, you grow up with that tradition. It's between Easter and October. It's every weekend you have a village that has bull games within a 30-mile radius. So it's something I grew up with, something I've always appreciated. And I wanted to make really play up Mourvèdre as we acquired a vineyard that faces the Camargue. And, you know, in France, we say that in order to be happy, the Mourvèdre needs a lot of sun and needs to see the water. And as you saw in that first picture at the opening of this webinar, the vineyards see the water. I believe we have an absolute fabulous spot for Mourvèdre. And Mourvèdre makes pretty masculine, pretty rugged, expressive wines. And I felt like I like to have a label that represents what you're going to find in the bottle. When you look at this bottle, you know you're going to have a wine that has, you know, oomph. And so that's why we have that label. So it's predominantly Mourvèdre, Grenache, a little bit of Syrah. Mourvèdre is about 50% destemmed, so is the Grenache. We age it in demi-muid, the 600 liters, for a couple of years, and 1 year as individual parts. Then we blend, and then it goes into barrels for a second year before we bottle it. So it's an incredibly, I'd say, representative of the area it grew. I mean, where the vineyards. It smells. It has the aromatics that you would find just walking through the vineyards in July or August. You'll have that laurel, that rosemary, thyme, that eucalyptus. All those aromatics that you find in this wine would be around the vineyards. And I don't know whether it's an aromatic transfer, or it's just another logic. But this is the mystery of wines, and that's why we love it.
That's exactly why. So this, again, I'm struck by the fact that this is a 2015, and this is your current release in the US right now? That's correct.
We are at the very tail end of that vintage in the U.S. We usually keep it another year or 2 years aging, and then a year in bottle.
So what a treat. So you actually do that cellaring work for us, and obviously
Right.
you've got a thinking there. Is it your opinion that the Mourvèdre needs that extra time in bottle to tame some of that ferocity? Are there other perhaps secondary types of flavors coming out of the wine that you want people to appreciate that they might not if you release the wine closer to vintage?
Yes, absolutely. I really think, I mean, you look at Bandol in their AOP rules, they need to age the wine 18 months in barrels and then a year in bottle before it could be released. I don't think it's you know, I mean, there's a reason for it. And I think it's true that the Mourvèdre needs time to really soften up and open up.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing this with us. I think it's a real treat that one doesn't have an opportunity necessarily have a Mourvèdre driven wine from this part of the world every day, and then to have one with the luxury of some bottle age on it. On te remercie, mon ami. So
Merci.
let's move on to our second wine. Oops, that we've got here, and of course I froze for a second. Let me see if I can figure this out here. Let's see, Alt tab, go. Always happens to me. Voila. Okay, back one. Back one. For those of you who were following along in blind tasting, I apologize if you saw that last thing. But our next wine here, wine number 5, is from our friend Michel Chapoutier. This is a new venture, I guess, for him. You can maybe tell us a little bit more about it in a minute, Michel. And this is a property or a wine, a cuvée that he calls La Ciboise. It's a blend of Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre, Cinsault, and a little bit of Carignan. So all 5 players there, as is everything with Michel Chapoutier's in conversion, very much into biodynamics and everything here. And this is a wine where the varieties are all vinified separately. Assemblage is put together. Everything is done in concrete, both fermentation and a short aging before the wine comes in the bottle. Really, I think in an effort to preserve the purity of not only the individual varieties, but obviously the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. Becomes an interesting story about the name on it. I guess my question here would be, we talked about the primacy of so many of the families here. Clearly, Monsieur Chapoutier is dare I don't say it with any judgment, but he's an outsider to your world. What is it like, and how are other people who are not of the area? How do you guys all work together? I assume because he's out there getting the word of Costières de Nimes out, that can't be anything but a great thing. How does that whole dynamic present itself?
Well, Michel was the president of Rhone Association for 6 years, and so even though he's based in the northern Rhone, he used to come to Avignon quite frequently. When he decided to actually acquire a vineyard in Costières de Nimes, um, obviously everyone was thrilled because of the reputation of Chapoutier, and the combination of the appellation with his name would do, great, great things for the awareness of our AOP. We were hoping that Monsieur Guigal would follow suit, but unfortunately he hasn't. So no, everyone was very positive. But he's a very busy man, and unfortunately, we don't have a lot of exchanges about Costières with him. I see him at Avignon, here and there, but he's a busy man.
Yeah, yeah. I think this wine is a delightful expression. I mean, it's the obviously it's a 2020 versus your 2015, and it's got expression. If anyone knows Michel Chapoutier, he's kind of like that. And the wines, I always think that wines are a lot like their winemakers or their people. It's kind of like people looking like their dogs after a while, or vice versa. This wine is kind of in that sort of exuberant way, the way he is. But again, because there's no oak, because it's fresh, because everything's there, I think it speaks to this wonderful just expression of of a familial blend of these 5 grapes, and done in a lovely way. For those of you who might know The wine's just a tad reductive. As you can see by the photo, it is under screw cap. We found that to be the case. And if you want to just let your glass sit out for the balance of your afternoon or your day or whatever, and come back to you and let, comes down a little bit more air gets into the wine. It's an extraordinarily expressive, very garrigue, very lavendery, but a lot of beautiful expression of fresh, bright fruit. To both black and red by nature. And last but not least, before we open up for any questions that people might have at the end here, it is appropriate. The one thing that you don't notice on this, if you don't have a full bottle, which you don't, is that the labels themselves are actually made of denim. And I just thought the first time I saw that, I thought I had a paper label and it was just sort of like fraying at the side until I went and touched it, and tactily, it's actually denim. And this is our friends at Chateau Beaubois, a leading producer of the area, the Boyer family, big producers there. And this is just a lovely wine they make, very traditional in style, with a little bit, again, larger, older oak, from partially fermented in oak and stainless steel, and just a very refreshing wine, very much at the cutting edge of the biological EcoCert, Demeter certified stuff, very natural winemaking. Thoughts on the Beaubois wines? Michel, your thoughts on the family?
No, it's a great dynamic team of brother and sister. Fanny is the older sister, is the winemaker, and she takes care of marketing the wines, and her brother, younger brother, takes care of the vineyards. They've been a driving force in the appellation. They're getting their wines out there. They're forward thinking. No, it's really one of the up and coming and leader of the appellation. And I think their wines have a distinctive style. They love the freshness, the lighter touch to their winemaking style. And they find their audience, and they're doing great. So kudos to them.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting. And what's intriguing, when comparing it to the other two wines, at least from my perspective, is there's a much more savory element to what they're doing. The Chapoutier is really very much about the fruit and the garrigue and everything. Yours is beautiful vinosity, complexity, but theirs is definitely more in that sort of savory vein, not so much expressive of bright, fresh fruit. But again, it just goes to show that we don't have monolithic wines made in this area.
Right.
So
They tend to favor they don't push ripeness as much to keep the freshness, and perhaps the savory nature that you mentioned of is due to that. It's a clear style that they have picked, and that is finding a great echo, at least here in Europe, for the freshness and the style. So.
Great, lovely. Well, on that note, everybody, for those of you who have time, and I know out there in the real world, a lot of you are probably on pins and needles, knowing that you need to get pulled here and there. So if you can't stay around or don't have any question to ask, please do not. But if there are, I'm looking at the Q&A box. I'm not seeing any there. But if you do have any questions, throw them in there in the Q&A box, and we can address them and talk about that further. And if not, we're going to wish you adieu. But if I want to give anybody who has a moment to throw a question in the Q&A box an opportunity. Maybe while I'm waiting for that, what a beautiful shot, Michel. Can you give us any context of where this vineyard might be, or what we might be looking at here as we wait for any last minute question?
This is probably in the middle of Costières, and it's my guess is it's looking southeast, and it's the beginning of the day. And you get a good glimpse of that rolled pebble terroir, and of the rolling nature of the Costières. And no, it's a beautiful shot, but it's very representative. We have a very beautiful AOP.
There you go. So. There you go. Well, I've got, I see here one question that just popped in here. And this is, actually, this is about a supplier of some of these wines there. And I think that maybe Eileen and Daphne might be able to address later more who is selling these wines where in Texas, but maybe that's something we can come back to. Nicholas asked, hey, Nicholas, how are you? Michelle, that you mentioned earlier in Nîmes that Mourvèdre likes to see the sea. Can you speak a little bit more about vinification in Mourvèdre and Nîmes compared to, say, Bandol or a place like that?
Um, I think that the vinification, I don't think that is that different. It might be the aging that's different. I think Bandol has a tradition of making reds that are predominantly Mourvèdre based, and they've mastered the aging, the barrels, or the food, or combination of for their Mourvèdre in Costières. I believe that Mourvèdre, either they're young vineyards and they usually folded into rosé production, and when they're older, I think that everyone's still playing with what suits their needs, the style they want to give to their wines. I don't think there is an approach as structured as what it is in Mourvèdre. We're still finding our style. So, but
I
it's a good question. Thank you.
Find more, we'll do it. Tiffany, I think Daphne said she's going to get back to you with all of these answers to what's available where. So since I'm not seeing any other specific questions, I just want to make a couple of points. Number one, obviously there's going to be a recording of this, and we will put it out there and follow up with you. So there are a few people I know who signed up but are specifically going to be watching this later on, and we thank them in advance for doing that. They get their shout out now after they've watched the entire video. For those of you who want to go back and pull anything later, we can. As Daphne mentioned, we'll answer some of these other questions there. Thank you for the kind words we're seeing coming in. It's all Michelle. It has nothing to do with
Come
yours
on,
truly.
Evan.
I'm just behind
You were
the
born
curtain.
for this.
But anyway, for those of you who are going to be joining myself and Sylvain Moret for Luberon next week, we look forward to seeing you. If you were just making a visit to Costières de Nimes with Michelle and I today, we thank you so much for your time. We look forward to seeing you. Go out there and be a bullish megaphone for this region that needs more love. We'll look forward to seeing, again, those of you who are coming to join us from Luberon soon. We'll follow up later. Michelle, thank you as always for your time, your story, your edification, your passion, your delicious wine, and we will look forward to catching up with all of you next time. So have a wonderful day, everybody. Have a wonderful evening, Michelle. For those of you who are in your afternoon, enjoy your afternoon. For those of you who are about to grab lunch like me, enjoy your lunch. And for those of you we'll see next week, we'll see you next week. And everybody else, we'll talk to you later. Take good care.
Thank you very much, and goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.